Today we are looking at a case from the middle of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to England. Joan Wolfe was born on the 11th of March 1923 in the small town of Tunbridge in the English county of Kent. She was the youngest of 3 children. When she was 7 years old, tragedy struck the family as her father, Charles Frederick Wolfe, who was 34, passed away unexpectedly. The loss reshaped her childhood, and less than a year later, her mother Edith remarried a man named Mr. Leslie John Wood, and at the end of 1931 gave birth to a daughter. Following this, the family moved to the town of Tunbridge Wells. Joan attended a Catholic school in Mark's Cross, where her tuition was generously covered by a wealthy aunt. She excelled in her studies, particularly in French, a language in which she became extremely proficient. Though Joan often appeared devout, regularly wearing a large crucifix, her religious devotion seemed more superficial than sincere. Her stepfather, Mr. Leslie Wood, was a notable figure in Tunbridge Wells, but his eccentric nature made him stand out for other reasons. He suffered from insomnia and was prone to sudden outbursts of paranoia and anger. Sometimes these happened in public, which unsettled those around him. In August 1939, a devastating event unfolded. Joan returned home from school to find her stepfather had sealed the kitchen and taken his own life by gassing himself. The shock and the grief weighed heavily on the family. When she was 16 years old, Joan became engaged to a wealthy young man who lived nearby. It was said that her fiancé was very attentive towards her, and Joan's mother was pleased that one of her children's future seemed set. However, towards the end of the year, Joan suddenly disappeared. Her mother called the police, but it took more than a month before she was eventually found, 60 miles away, in the town of Aldershot. Her fiancé's mother then drove there and brought her back to Tunbridge Wells. Despite returning, Joan's sense of unease only deepened. The security of her engagement couldn't suppress the growing feelings of restlessness, and she began to feel increasingly stifled by the expectations placed on her. A life of comfort and predictability no longer appealed to her, and she longed for independence and a sense of purpose. Shortly after the outbreak of World War II, she made the bold decision to end the engagement and head to London. There she pursued training as a storekeeper in an aircraft factory. However, after just a month, she left her job but decided to keep this secret from her mother. This marked a significant shift in her life as her once stable behaviour began to decline. She had always been somewhat naive and gullible, likely due to her heavily sheltered convent upbringing, but she now started associating with soldiers, many of whom were Canadian servicemen stationed in Britain during World War II. The excitement of the city and the attention from these men seemed to draw her in, offering a freedom she had never experienced before. Her mother, Mrs. Edith Wood, was deeply worried about Joan's choices, particularly now with the war raging across Europe. She had always expected her to be more responsible and often urged Joan to return home, pleading with her to leave her reckless life behind. Concerned about her safety and well-being, Mrs. Wood even involved the local police in an attempt to bring Joan back to Tunbridge Wells. However, Joan stubbornly refused any intervention, perhaps seeing her mother's concern as stifling. Her independence and new social experiences were a stark contrast to the quiet, controlled life she had led before. Despite the increased tension between them, Joan did not completely sever ties with her family. She maintained a level of communication through letters and occasional visits to Tunbridge Wells. On these occasions, she would sometimes introduce her mother to the Canadian soldier she was currently dating, perhaps hoping to ease her mother's worries. But each time Joan returned home, Mrs. Wood would confront her, urging her to abandon what she saw as an irresponsible and dangerous way of living. Outwardly, it may have appeared that Joan was enjoying her time in London, but beneath the surface her circumstances were far from ideal. She struggled to find stability, never staying employed for long, and frequently moving from one lodging to another. Eventually she left London and went to live in the quiet village of Thursley, about 6 miles from Goalming, in the county of Surrey. Here she looked for work and stayed in the bungalow of an elderly woman named Kate Hayter, who she assisted with cooking and cleaning. Although this was a far cry from the vibrancy of London, it was clear that Joan's life lacked the security and direction her mother so desperately wished for her. In 1942, Joan's mother married for the 3rd time. Her new husband was a man named Charles Watts. Joan continued to live in the small village of Thursley near Godalming, and during this time she became engaged to a Canadian soldier named Francis Hearn. She proudly wore his engagement ring, and sometimes told people that they were already married, though this was not the case. However, in July of that year, her fiancé was sent back to Canada, leaving Joan heartbroken and unsure about her future. However, Francis Hearn's regiments were replaced in Godalming by the Canadian Regina Rifle Regiment. Just 2 days after bidding her fiancé farewell, Joan crossed paths with another Canadian soldier, a man named Auguste Sangret. Feeling downcast and lonely, Joan went to a local pub. She had not bothered to change her clothes and appeared quite dishevelled. But she met Auguste, and they struck up a conversation that lasted well into the evening. At the end of the night he walked her home, a journey that took much longer than it normally would. As they lingered along the way, they agreed to meet again a few days later. Joan, however, failed to show up for the arranged meeting. However, fate intervened once more, when on the 21st of July, they unexpectedly met at a fish and chip shop. Joan had originally planned to go out with another Canadian soldier named Private Harnell, but when she saw Auguste again, she quickly changed her plans and agreed to spend the evening with him instead. It was that night, during their conversation, that Joan confided in him that she had nowhere to stay and revealed her unstable circumstances and the vulnerability she felt. Auguste had been born in 1913 in the town of Battleford in Saskatchewan. He came from a mixed-race background with French-Canadian and Indigenous ancestry. Unfortunately, he had not received any formal education, which meant that he was unable to read or write. However, he was fluent in both the English and the Cree language, and had learned various traditional skills from his ancestors. His proficiency in outdoor survival skills was remarkable, and he told Joan that he would build her a wigwam, where she would be able to sleep comfortably. That night, they both slept in the wigwam, and early the next morning, Auguste returned to his barracks. But before he left, he gave Joan his photograph, and they made plans to meet again. Over the next few days, he improved the wigwam and also furnished it with army pillows and blankets. However, on the 23rd of July, Joan was admitted to hospital after she fainted while out shopping. She wrote to Auguste asking him to visit her, but when he arrived at the hospital, he was informed that he had missed visiting hours and was turned away. A few days later, Joan sent another letter, suggesting that she might be pregnant. When Joan was discharged, she returned to the wigwam on Hackley Common, where she continued to live for the next few weeks. She briefly secured a job in a factory making barrage balloons, but she lost it due to her poor timekeeping. As the pressure on her situation mounted, she began to feel overwhelmed and expressed a desire to return to live with her family. She wrote to her mother to explain her predicament, but when she received no reply, she decided to look again for work, and with few options, returned to live in the wigwam. Eventually, a military policeman named Donald Brett discovered Joan living on Army-designated land and instructed her to leave the area. He also ordered Auguste to dismantle the wigwam. Although they both complied to this demand, Auguste returned to the area and constructed another wigwam nearby. Joan then used this to sleep in, while she attempted to find somewhere else to live. But things were not going well. Auguste was detained by military police for illegally keeping a female civilian on military grounds, and Joan was taken back to hospital by Surrey police for her own safety. She was made to stay there until the 1st of September. While Joan was in hospital, Auguste sought permission to marry her. Unfortunately, he was told that he needed her mother's consent and the approval of the Canadian government. Though he was given the necessary paperwork, he was unable to read and write, so did not complete it. On leaving the hospital, with nowhere to go, she ended up spending the night alone in the waiting room of the railway station. By the 3rd of September, she had moved into an abandoned cricket pavilion in Thursley, and Auguste brought her an army blanket and a water bottle stolen from his barracks, and over the next 2 weeks, he visited her as often as he could. He brought food, and they discussed their plans, including the marriage Joan so desperately wanted. When they couldn't meet, Joan would write him letters, which Sergeant Charles Hicks would read to him and help him reply to. Her letters were filled with hope, but in them she also expressed frustration over August's jealousy and his accusations of infidelity. But she would always assure him that she was faithful and wanted to focus on their future. Although Joan's situation was difficult, she managed to find temporary employment. But again, she was soon dismissed for being unreliable. So now, in order to generate some income, she would gather blackberries on Hankley Common, which August then sold to the Canadian soldiers. With the money they made, Joan would buy knitting supplies to make baby clothes. On the 14th of September 1942, just 2 months after Joan and August had first met, Miss Joan Wolfe disappeared. People started to notice that August was now going out alone, and to many it seemed that he was indifferent about the fact she had suddenly gone missing. When questioned, he would sometimes say that Joan had returned home and called off their wedding, while other times he would insist that she was in hospital. A week after her disappearance, he asked Sergeant Harold Wade in help in locating her. He said that they had argued over his doubts about marriage, but then strangely added, "If she should be found, and anything has happened to her, I don't want to be mixed up in it." However, despite this concern, he was still seen out in the company of other young ladies. The morning of the 7th of October 1942, Royal Marines William Moore and Geoffrey Cook were out on routine patrol in the woods when they passed some freshly disturbed earth and saw what looked like a human arm, which had been partially eaten by animals. On closer inspection, they also saw a human foot. Although slightly taken aback, without disturbing the area, the Marines reported the discovery to their commanding officer. Lieutenant Norman MacLeod immediately came to the scene and then alerted Surrey Police. Superintendent Richard Webb and Thomas Roberts were sent to the site in order to secure it before detectives from Scotland Yard took over. Realising the seriousness of the discovery, a pathologist was sent for to recover the corpse. The victim was female and was wearing a green and white dress with wool socks. She lay face down in a shallow grave. Her left arm was tucked beneath her, while her right arm was outstretched, suggesting that she had been dragged to the burial site. The body showed extensive decomposition, with severe head trauma, likely indicating a cause of death. The pathologist estimated that the death occurred 5 to 7 weeks prior, but needed to conduct a more thorough examination, so the body was subsequently transported to Guy's Hospital for an autopsy. This revealed that the female victim was approximately 17 to 20 years old, 5 foot 4 inches tall, with sandy brown hair that had been dyed blonde. After reconstructing the skull from 38 fragments, they identified a severe impact at the back of the head, likely caused by a single forceful blow with a wooden object. They said that this would have caused rapid unconsciousness, and then death within minutes. A fracture to the right cheekbone supported the conclusion that the victim had been lying face down during the fatal blow. Dr. Simpson noted defensive wounds on the victim's right arm and hand, indicating that she likely faced her attacker while attempting to protect herself. The pattern of the stab wounds suggested that the weapon used had a curved or hooked tip, which created distinctive circular marks. The presence of multiple injuries, including a broken jaw and dislodged teeth, led him to believe that the victim had been conscious for much of the assault and may have tried to escape before collapsing. Based on the body's condition and the level of decomposition, Dr. Simpson estimated that the victim died in early to mid-September and had remained exposed for about 24 hours before being hastily buried. On the 12th of October, 5 days after the body had been found, 60 officers were sent to search the area. They came across a sharpened birchwood bow, shoes, a purse, crucifix, and a letter written to a Canadian soldier named Auguste Sangret, informing him that she was pregnant. They also found a national registration card with the name Joan Pearl Wolfe, along with a fragment of a skull and a tooth. With this information, Miss Wolfe's mother, Miss Edith Watts, was contacted and confirmed that these items belonged to her daughter. The body found on Hankley Common had now been identified. Superintendent Richard Webb remembered Joan's name. He had spoken to her twice before, when she was briefly detained due to concerns about her welfare. He recalled that her companion had been a Canadian soldier, the same one mentioned in the letter near her body. Auguste Sangret was then interviewed by Chief Inspector Greenough, and Superintendent Webb He admitted dating Joan, but claimed that he hadn't seen her since the 14th of September. He stated that he hadn't taken the relationship too seriously and was more interested in another woman he'd met in Glasgow. He added that although he hadn't reported her missing to the police, he had informed his sergeant that she had disappeared. Inspector Greenough obtained permission to bring him to Goalming police station for a formal interview. There, the soldier agreed to disclose all he knew about Joan, which remarkably resulted in a 17,000-word statement, the longest in British criminal history at the time. This was recorded over 4 days. In his statement, he detailed his relationship with Joan and what he had done following her disappearance. He also informed the inspector about Kate Hayter, the elderly lady whose bungalow Joan sometimes stayed in. Later, he guided officers to the locations where he had constructed wigwams. August also admitted arguing with Joan about marriage during their last encounter, though he denied ever harming her. On the 16th of October, he was released, pending further investigation. Strangely, before leaving, he said, "I suppose you have found her. Everything points to me. I guess I shall get the blame." And then he buried his head in his hands. August's army blanket and uniform were sent to Dr. Roach Lynch for examination. Dr. Lynch found that both had been hastily washed, but there were still bloodstains on them. He believed that the blood-stained areas on the blankets aligned with the victim's injuries, suggesting that the blanket had been used to wrap her body. Chief Inspector Greenough also interviewed August Sangret's colleagues, who revealed that the private had told conflicting stories about Joan's absence. They also said that he had recently seemed quite anxious. The investigation continued until on the 27th of November, a distinctive knife with a hooked point was found hidden in a waste pipe at the army camp. Forensic analysis revealed that although weeks in a drainage system had removed any traces of blood or fingerprints, the blade type was consistent with the one that had been used to inflict Joan's injuries. The police also discovered that although this specific knife was British made, it had previously been issued to Canadian forces. Inspector Greenough believed that August Sangret had committed this crime, so on the 6th of December took him to Hankley Common to identify the areas that he and Joan had frequented. Strangely, although Private Sangret complied, he refused to approach Houndown Woods, the place where Joan's body was discovered. August was then questioned about the knife, but all he said was that it belonged to Joan, as her previous fiancé Francis Hearn had given it to her. Later that afternoon, Private August Sangret was charged with the murder of Joan Pearl Wolfe and taken to Brixton Prison to await further proceedings. A committal hearing opened in the town of Guildford on the 12th of January 1943. Witnesses included forensic experts, the police, and Canadian soldiers who served alongside the accused. Inspector Greenough presented the extensive statements that had been made by August and highlighted his remark that following the discovery of the body, he had said, "I suppose you have found her. Everything points to me. I guess I shall get the blame." On the 20th of January, Mr. Justice McNaughton concluded that the evidence was sufficient for August Sangret to be sent to trial. The trial of August Sangret for the murder of Joan Wolfe opened on the 24th of February 1943 at Surrey County Hall. As proceedings began, the defendant entered a plea of not guilty. Mr. Eric Neve, representing the Crown, set the stage by summarising the prosecution's case. He outlined the defendant's relationship with the victim, who he referred to as Wigwam Girl. He spoke of the knife and the birch bow, which he believed were the weapons used to kill the young woman, and recounted the defendant's contradictory statements about the victim's whereabouts after her disappearance. The defence was led by Mr. Linton Thorpe, who challenged the claim that the knife found was the defendant's and questioned the credibility of the prosecution witnesses. He also told the court that Miss Wolfe was known to associate with many soldiers and suggested that given her lifestyle, any of the 100,000 stationed nearby could have been the actual perpetrator of this horrible crime. On the first day of the trial, 17 witnesses gave evidence. The Surrey Constabulary Detective Superintendent introduced the evidence that had been found near Hankley Common and other items that belonged to Joan. On the second day, military personnel informed the court of August Sangret's interactions with Miss Wolfe and how his account of where she actually was kept changing. Canadian Army Sergeant Hicks, also testified that he had helped the defendant write letters to Joan. Dr. Simpson and Dr. Gardner told of their forensic results following the examination of the body and how they were able to match the wounds to a distinctive hook blade found at the army camp. Dr. Roach Lynch confirmed that after thorough tests, he had been able to ascertain that there were bloodstains on the defendant's blanket and clothing, despite the fact that they had been washed. The accused man, August Sangret, testified in his own defence, and this lasted for some time. He denied ownership of the knife and refuted claims that he had been indifferent towards Joan. However, the prosecution cross-examined him vigorously on the inconsistencies in his statements. The 9-day trial had a total of 52 prosecution witnesses, while August was the only one to testify in his defence. When closing arguments were presented, prosecutor Eric Neve reminded the jury of the testimony from the forensic experts, the investigators, and military personnel, and said that this combined evidence proved that the defendant was guilty. He went on to say that August Sangret had buried the body and then attempted to create an alibi and hide the murder weapon. When Mr. Linton Thorpe addressed the jury on behalf of the defence, he said that the prosecution had not proved the case and that all the evidence was only circumstantial. He stressed that his client was engaged to Joan Wolfe and was very concerned as to her whereabouts when she disappeared. Justice McNaughton then turned to the jury and told them that if they were to find the defendant guilty, they must be sure of this, beyond any reasonable doubt. The jury then retired to deliberate, taking with them Miss Joan Wolfe's skull and the alleged murder weapon to help them make their decision. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to declare that they found the defendant, August Sangret, guilty of the murder of Joan Wolfe. They then strongly recommended mercy. When August was asked if he wished to speak before sentencing, he replied that he did, and looking straight at the judge, he said, "I am not guilty, sir. I never killed that girl." Nevertheless, Mr. Justice McNaughton sentenced him to death. Without consulting his counsel, August filed for appeal, which was heard on the 13th of April. Both original counsels attended the hearing. However, since August had filed the appeal without consulting them, neither Linton Thorpe or Lawrence Vine could challenge the trial or verdict beyond August's own statements, where he had disputed the guilty verdict, asserted his innocence, and denied owning the alleged murder weapon. Linton Thorpe, however, was able to emphasise the jury's strong recommendation for mercy. Despite this, the appeal court upheld the conviction and sentence, citing that there was an abundance of evidence against the guilty party. The matter of clemency was then brought before the Home Secretary Herbert Morrison, but he declined to intervene. On the 29th of April 1943, August Sangret was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. He was later buried there in an unmarked grave. When the body was being prepared for the burial, a tattoo on August's right arm was revealed, bearing the name of Joan Wolfe. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case